Picture this. It's 3 in the morning, April 1860. A 16-year-old boy stands shivering in the darkness of a makeshift station somewhere in the Nevada wilderness, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. His hands are cracked and bleeding from the rains, his face sunburned on one side and frostbitten on the other. He's been awake for nearly 20 hours. In his trembling fingers, he clutches a leather pouch containing letters that could start wars, end them, make fortunes, or break hearts across a continent. In 15 minutes, he'll climb onto a half-wild Mustang he's never ridden before and tear off into a moonless night where anything, and I mean anything, could be waiting to kill him. Bandits who'd gut him for his boots. Wolves. Blizzards that could bury him alive. Cliffs he won't see until he's falling off them. And this teenager, this kid who should be worrying about school dances and Sunday dinners, will ride like hell itself is chasing him because somewhere 2,000 miles away, people are desperately waiting for the words he's carrying. This wasn't a job. This was a suicide mission with a salary. And yet, boys lined up to do it. Welcome to the true story of the Pony Express, where we're ripping away every romanticized Hollywood fantasy you've ever seen and exposing the raw, bloody, magnificent truth about the teenagers who literally bet their lives on delivering your mail. Forget the sanitized history books and the clean-cut heroes on commemorative stamps. We're diving deep into the mud, blood, and terror of what it actually meant to be a Pony Express rider. And I promise you, the reality is far more compelling than any legend. These weren't mythical cowboys on noble steeds. They were desperate kids, many of them orphans with nowhere else to go, who chose 18 months of hell on earth over starvation or obscurity. They faced down death so regularly that it became routine. They pushed themselves and their animals past every reasonable limit. And they did it all for one simple reason: America needed them to. So buckle up, because we're about to gallop headfirst into one of history's most brutal, most overlooked, and most absolutely insane endeavors. The Pony Express, where boys became legends and most didn't live long enough to brag about it. To understand why anyone would sign up for this madness, you have to understand just how desperate America was in 1860. This wasn't just any year. This was the year the entire nation stood on a knife's edge, ready to tear itself apart. The country had exploded westward with shocking speed. California had become a state a decade earlier, bringing with it gold, opportunity, and hundreds of thousands of settlers who'd risked everything to build new lives on the Pacific coast. But here's the problem. Those settlers might as well have been living on another planet. Communication between the East and West coasts was an absolute nightmare. If you wanted to send a letter from New York to San Francisco, you had 3 options, and they were all terrible. You could send it by ship around the southern tip of South America, a journey that took anywhere from 4 to 6 months and risked shipwreck, pirates, and tropical diseases. You could send it by ship to Panama, trek across the disease-ridden jungle on foot, and then catch another ship up to California, which still took about a month if everything went perfectly, which it rarely did. Or you could send it overland by stagecoach, bouncing along rutted trails through hostile territory for 3 to 4 weeks, assuming the coach didn't get robbed, destroyed, or lost along the way. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Business deals that required quick decisions were impossible. Political news arrived so late it was practically ancient history. Personal letters announcing births, deaths, marriages, or emergencies reached their recipients months after the fact, when it was far too late to do anything about them. The California legislature was making decisions based on information that was wildly out of date. The federal government in Washington had virtually no real-time control over what happened in its western territories. And with tensions rising between North and South, with the nation careening towards civil war, the inability to communicate quickly wasn't just inconvenient. It was potentially catastrophic. California's loyalty hung in the balance. Would it side with the Union or the Confederacy when war finally came? Nobody knew, and without fast communication, there was no way to influence that decision. The government desperately needed a way to bind California to the Union, to make those distant settlers feel connected to the nation's heartland, to prove that despite the miles of wilderness between them, they were all still one country. Enter 3 entrepreneurs with more ambition than sense: William Russell, Alexander Majors, and William Waddell. These men ran a freighting company, and they'd made good money hauling supplies across the frontier. But they dreamed bigger. They envisioned something that sounded absolutely insane to everyone who heard it. A mail service that could get a letter from Missouri to California in 10 days. 10 days. That was faster than anything anyone had ever imagined. The transcontinental telegraph was being built, sure, but it was years away from completion, and in the meantime, the nation was bleeding for want of rapid communication. So these three men gambled everything, and I mean everything, on an idea so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that even their friends thought they'd lost their minds. They would create a relay system of riders and horses spanning nearly 2,000 miles of the most dangerous, unforgiving terrain on the continent. They would establish stations every 10 to 15 miles where fresh horses waited. They would recruit the lightest, toughest, most fearless riders they could find. And they would run this operation day and night, in all weather, through all dangers, with military precision. The Pony Express was born not from careful planning and government funding, but from sheer desperate faith that it could be done because it had to be done. Now here's where the story gets really dark, really fast. When Russell, Majors, and Waddell started recruiting riders, they weren't looking for experienced men. They weren't looking for tough, weathered cowboys or hardened frontiersmen. They wanted boys. Specifically, they wanted teenage boys who weighed less than 125 pounds, because every ounce mattered when you were asking a horse to run at breakneck speed for 10 to 15 miles straight. The advertisements they placed in newspapers have become legendary, and for good reason. They didn't sugarcoat anything. Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. Let that sink in. Orphans preferred. They literally wanted kids with no family. No one who would miss them if they didn't come back. No one who would sue the company or cause a fuss if they ended up dead in a ditch somewhere. This wasn't hidden in fine print. This was stated openly, baldly, without shame. The job was so dangerous that they preferred hiring boys who had nobody. And boys came. They came in droves. Some were genuinely orphaned, products of the harsh frontier where parents died young from disease, accidents, or violence. Some had families but were desperate for money, willing to risk everything for the promise of decent wages, around $25 a month, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that most laborers made less than 10. Some came for adventure, their heads filled with romantic notions of heroism and glory. Some came because they had something to prove, to themselves or to others. Some came because they'd committed crimes and needed to disappear into the wilderness where nobody asked questions. And some came simply because there was nothing else for them, no other path forward, no other way to matter in a world that had largely forgotten they existed. The company didn't just hire any boy who showed up, though. The selection process was rigorous. You had to prove you could ride, really ride, not just sit on a horse but become one with it, controlling it at full gallop across treacherous terrain. You had to prove you could handle a gun, because you might need to defend the mail, yourself, or both. You had to be in peak physical condition, because this job would break you if you weren't. But here's the part that really gets me. The detail that reveals just how seriously these companies took the moral weight of what they were doing, even as they sent teenagers into mortal danger. Every single rider, before he was hired, had to take an oath. Not just promise to do his job, but swear a formal oath before God and witnesses. They had to swear they would not fight, curse, or get drunk while in the company's employ. They had to swear they would conduct themselves with honor and integrity at all times. They were each given a Bible to carry with them on their rides. Now, you might think this was purely practical, a way to ensure the riders didn't gamble away their wages or show up drunk to work. But it was more than that. These men who ran the Pony Express knew they were sending boys to probable death, and they wanted those boys to die as good men, to meet their maker with clear consciences and clean souls. It was both touching and absolutely horrifying. They were essentially saying, "We know this will probably kill you, so please don't let it also damn you." The riders took the oath seriously, too. By all accounts, the vast majority of them lived up to it, maintaining remarkable discipline and integrity even in circumstances where no one would have known or cared if they'd broken their promises. They carried their Bibles alongside the mail, and some of them died with both in their possession. So what was it actually like to be a Pony Express rider? What did a typical run look like? Let me paint you a picture that's a lot less romantic than the paintings you've seen. You'd arrive at your home station, which was rarely more than a crude cabin or even just a dugout in a hillside, and you'd wait for the rider before you to come thundering in. You'd hear him before you saw him, the pounding of hooves, maybe a shout, maybe a gunshot to signal his approach. He'd slide off his exhausted, foam-covered horse, and the station keeper would already have your fresh mount ready, a wiry Mustang that probably wasn't fully broken, dancing and snorting and wanting nothing more than to throw you into the dirt. The mochila, the special leather mail pouch designed to fit over the saddle, would be thrown onto your horse in seconds. This wasn't a bag or a satchel. It was a brilliant piece of engineering, a leather covering with 4 lockable pouches at the corners that could be transferred from saddle to saddle in under 2 minutes. The rider coming in might gasp out some information, road conditions, dangers ahead, weather warnings, but there was no time for long conversations. You'd mount up and you'd go, and then you'd ride. You'd ride like hell itself was behind you and heaven was ahead. The company expected you to maintain an average speed of 10 miles per hour across your entire route, which meant you needed to gallop much faster than that on good terrain to make up for the times when you'd be slowed by mud, snow, rivers, or mountains. You rode alone, completely alone, through landscapes that could be breathtakingly beautiful and terrifyingly deadly in the same moment. In the early miles, you might pass through relatively settled territory where farms dotted the landscape, and you could see signs of civilization. But soon enough, you'd be in the real wilderness, riding through terrain where you might not see another human being for hours or days. The loneliness was crushing. Just you, your horse, and the thunder of hooves on hard ground. The landscape varied wildly depending on your route. Some riders crossed the Great Plains, endless miles of rolling grassland where you could see for what seemed like forever, which meant you could spot danger coming, but also meant there was absolutely nowhere to hide. Some crossed the Rockies, navigating mountain passes where one misstep would send you and your horse tumbling hundreds of feet to certain death. Some crossed deserts where the heat could kill you as surely as any bullet, where water sources were few and far between, where you'd wrap yourself in wet cloths just to keep from cooking in your own skin. Every single mile brought new dangers. Bandits were a constant threat, men who'd learned that Pony Express riders sometimes carried valuable correspondence and who didn't mind killing a teenager to get it. You rode armed, usually with a revolver and sometimes a rifle, but you were one boy against however many outlaws might be lying in wait, and your horse was already exhausted from running. Your best defense wasn't your gun, it was speed. If you saw suspicious riders, you ran. You ran harder and faster than you'd ever run before, because stopping meant dying. Some riders were chased for miles, bullets whistling past their heads, their horses' lungs burning, pushing the animal beyond what should have been possible because the alternative was death. And sometimes, speed wasn't enough. Sometimes the bandits were too many, too well-positioned, too well-armed. We know of riders who were shot off their horses, who fought to their last breath defending the mail, who were found days later by the next rider, their bodies left where they'd fallen. Then there were the Native American tribes, and here's where the history gets complicated and requires honesty. The Pony Express route cut directly through territories that belonged to various tribes, Paiute, Shoshone, Lakota, and others, people who had every reason to be hostile to white intruders racing across their lands. The relationship between the Pony Express and Native Americans varied dramatically by region and tribe. Some tribes were neutral or even helpful, trading with the station keepers and largely leaving the riders alone. Others were actively at war with white settlers and saw the Pony Express as a legitimate military target, which, frankly, it sometimes was, since riders occasionally carried military communications. The most dangerous period came during the Paiute War of 1860, when coordinated attacks on Pony Express stations killed station keepers and riders, destroyed stations, and scattered horse herds. Riders during this period knew they might be riding into an ambush at any moment. Some carried messages warning of attacks, racing to deliver news that might save lives at the next station, knowing their own lives hung by a thread. But honestly, the most consistent killer wasn't bandits or arrows, it was nature itself. Weather on the frontier was extreme beyond modern imagination. Summer heat in the desert could reach 120 degrees or more, hot enough that riders suffered heat stroke, delirium, and sometimes death. They'd pour water over themselves, over their horses, but water was scarce and heavy, so you never carried much. Winter was worse. Blizzards would blow in with terrifying speed, whiteout conditions where you couldn't see your horse's head in front of you, where the wind cut through every layer of clothing like knives, where snow piled so deep your horse could barely move. Riders froze to death in their saddles, their bodies found weeks later when the snow melted, still mounted, still holding the reins, the mail still secured. Others survived only by the most desperate measures, killing their horses and sleeping inside the carcass for warmth, then walking the rest of their route carrying the mail on their backs. Rivers were deadly barriers. The route crossed countless waterways, from small streams to major rivers like the Platte and the Missouri. In good weather, you'd ford them on horseback, a dangerous enough proposition when the current was strong. In spring, when snowmelt turned them into raging torrents, crossing could be suicidal. Riders drowned. Horses drowned. The mail sometimes made it across, sometimes didn't. Let me share some specific stories, real accounts that drive home just how insane this job was. There's the famous ride of Robert "Pony Bob" Haslam, who's become legendary for good reason. In May 1860, during the Paiute War, Haslam arrived at his relief station to find it had been destroyed and his replacement rider dead. He had a choice: stop there and wait for help, or keep going. He kept going. He rode his regular route, then his replacement's route, then beyond, covering 185 miles through hostile territory with almost no rest, switching horses at stations when he could find them intact, pressing on alone when he couldn't. He was shot at, chased, nearly killed multiple times, and when he finally reached safety, he'd been in the saddle for 24 hours straight. His reward? He got to rest for 8 hours, then ride the same route back. Or consider Jack Keatley, who rode through a blizzard so severe he couldn't see anything, navigating by instinct and faith alone. When he finally reached his station, he was so frozen he couldn't dismount. The station keeper had to lift him off the horse and thaw him by the fire. Parts of his face and fingers had turned black with frostbite. He rode again 2 days later. Then there's the tragedy of riders who simply vanished. We don't even know all their names. They rode out from one station and never arrived at the next. Maybe bandits got them. Maybe they fell off a cliff in the dark. Maybe they got lost in a storm. Maybe their horse threw them and they broke their neck. We'll never know because their bodies were never found. They just disappeared into the vastness, and all that remained was a failure of the mail to arrive, a gap in the schedule, a quiet notation in company records that a rider was missing, presumed dead. The company would hire a replacement, and the express would go on, because it always had to go on. The mail had to get through, no matter how many boys it took, no matter how many mothers would never know what happened to their sons. As brutal as the experience was for the riders, you have to admire the sheer logistical genius of the operation. The Pony Express wasn't just brave kids on fast horses. It was a marvel of organization and planning that would impress modern military strategists. The entire 2,000-mile route from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, was divided into divisions, each overseen by a division superintendent. Within each division were stations, placed roughly every 10 to 15 miles, the distance a horse could run at top speed before it was completely spent. There were two types of stations: home stations and relay stations. Relay stations were usually just crude shelters where fresh horses waited, sometimes not even a building, but just a corral and a horsekeeper who lived in a tent or dugout. Home stations were more substantial, with sleeping quarters, stables, and supplies, placed every 75 to 100 miles. This was where riders would complete their run and rest while another rider took over. The horses themselves were carefully selected for the job. Contrary to popular imagination, they weren't massive, powerful stallions. They were small, tough Mustangs, usually around 14 hands high, bred or caught in the wild for their endurance, sure-footedness, and speed. The company maintained about 400 to 500 horses at any given time, replacing them constantly as they broke down from the brutal pace. These horses were rotated carefully, given time to recover between runs when possible, though time to recover might only mean a few days. The station keepers were their own brand of heroes, men who'd signed up to live in isolated outposts, caring for horses and waiting for riders who might show up at any hour of the day or night. They lived rough, often endanger themselves from bandits or hostile tribes, responsible for maintaining the stock and the station on minimal supplies. Many of them were former riders who'd been injured or aged out of riding. They understood the stakes, and they took their jobs seriously because a rider's life might depend on whether his fresh horse was ready and in good condition. The mochila system was brilliantly designed. Instead of transferring letters from bag to bag, which would take precious time, the entire leather mail cover simply lifted off one saddle and dropped onto the next. The 4 pouches were locked, and only stations at major cities had keys to open them. This meant even if bandits killed a rider and stole the mochila, they couldn't access most of the mail, which reduced the incentive to rob the express. It also meant riders themselves didn't know what they were carrying most of the time. They were carrying secrets, fortunes, declarations of love, news of death, business contracts worth millions, military orders, political correspondence that could change the nation's course, and they'd die protecting it without ever knowing what it said. The cost to send a letter via Pony Express was steep, $5 per half-ounce initially, later reduced to $1. In modern terms, that's well over $100 to send a single letter. Only the most urgent, most important correspondence went by Pony Express. Every letter that went into the mochila mattered desperately to someone. What kind of mail justified that cost? Business communications, primarily. California's economy was booming, and business deals involving gold, property, and trade required quick decisions. Investors needed to know market conditions, prices, opportunities before their competitors did. Political correspondence was crucial, especially as tensions escalated toward the Civil War. President Buchanan and later President Lincoln needed to communicate with California's government, to shore up Union support, to convey military orders as war approached. When Lincoln won the election in November 1860, news of his victory reached California via Pony Express in days rather than weeks, a crucial moment in keeping California loyal to the Union. Newspapers used the Pony Express to scoop their competitors. Major papers would pay premium rates to get breaking news from the other coast faster than anyone else, then print special editions trumpeting their exclusive information. And yes, personal letters too. Letters about births and deaths, marriages and divorces, pleas for help, declarations of love, all the human drama that couldn't wait months for conventional mail. Every one of those letters was carried by a teenager risking his life. Here's the cruel irony at the heart of the Pony Express story. It was designed to be temporary from the very beginning. Russell, Majors, and Waddell knew the transcontinental telegraph was being built. Everyone knew. The Pacific Telegraph Act had been passed. Crews were stringing wire across the continent from both directions, and it was only a matter of time before they met in the middle. The Pony Express was never meant to be a permanent solution. It was a stopgap, a desperate measure to fill the communication void until technology could provide a better answer. But the founders hoped, desperately hoped, that the Pony Express would prove so valuable, so essential, that the government would award them the lucrative federal mail contract, which would provide enough income to make the operation profitable and sustainable even after the telegraph arrived for routine communications. It didn't happen. The federal government, impressed though they were with what the Pony Express achieved, never awarded that contract. The operation hemorrhaged money from day one. The initial investment was massive, purchasing hundreds of horses, building or leasing nearly 200 stations, hiring riders and station keepers, advertising, and maintaining everything. The operating costs were astronomical. Feed for the horses alone was staggering. Replacing horses that died or were stolen or simply broke down. Paying riders and station keepers. Repairing or rebuilding stations after attacks. The Pony Express charged high rates, but even at $5 per letter, they couldn't come close to breaking even. Russell, Majors, and Waddell poured more and more of their own money into the operation, taking on debt, mortgaging assets, gambling that the government contract would eventually come through and save them. Meanwhile, the telegraph crews worked steadily eastward from California and westward from the Missouri River. The technology was proven. Once the wire was strung and the connections made, messages that took the Pony Express 10 days would transmit instantaneously. There was no competition. The Pony Express couldn't possibly compete with the speed of electricity. By the fall of 1861, the two telegraph lines were approaching each other in Utah. On October 24th, 1861, they connected. For the first time, California and the eastern states could communicate instantly. News that would have taken 10 days by Pony Express now took seconds. The reaction was swift. Within days, the Pony Express was finished. There was simply no market for their service anymore. Why pay $1 to send a letter that would arrive in 10 days when you could send a telegram that would arrive in minutes? The last official Pony Express run occurred in late October 1861, just 18 months after the first run in April 1860. The financial collapse was catastrophic. Russell, Majors, and Waddell's company went bankrupt. They lost everything. Russell was briefly imprisoned for financial irregularities. Majors spent the rest of his life in poverty. The men who dreamed so big, who'd accomplished something genuinely incredible, were ruined by it. The riders and station keepers were left unemployed. Many of them owed back wages they'd never receive. Some drifted into other frontier jobs. Some joined the army when the Civil War escalated. Some just disappeared back into obscurity. The stations were abandoned, left to rot or be scavenged for materials by settlers. The horses were sold off or released. Within a few years, you could travel the old Pony Express route and find barely any trace that it had ever existed. So if the Pony Express was such a financial disaster, if it lasted barely a year and a half, why do we still remember it? Why has it become such an enduring part of American mythology? Because what it represented transcended profit and loss. The Pony Express, in its brief, glorious, doomed existence, proved something essential about the American character and the American moment. It proved that the continent could be connected, that the vast distances could be overcome, that nothing, not mountains, not deserts, not winter storms, not hostile forces, could prevent determined people from accomplishing what seemed impossible. It proved that California was not an isolated outpost, but an integral part of the nation, connected by more than just abstract political boundaries. The timing was crucial. The Pony Express operated during the most critical period in American history, the months leading up to and the first year of the Civil War. It carried Lincoln's inaugural address to California. It carried news of battles, of political developments, of the nation tearing itself apart. It helped keep California loyal to the Union when that loyalty was genuinely in question. Historians have argued, convincingly I think, that the Pony Express played a real role in preventing California from staying neutral or even siding with the Confederacy. By keeping communication lines open, by proving that California mattered to the federal government, by creating a tangible connection between East and West, the Pony Express helped hold the nation together at its most fragile moment. But beyond the historical and political impact, the Pony Express captured the imagination in a way that few historical events have managed. Here was everything Americans wanted to believe about themselves: courage, determination, youth, speed, the conquest of wilderness, the triumph of individual heroism over impossible odds. The riders became instant legends. Dime novels and newspapers churned out stories about their exploits, sometimes exaggerated but often barely needing exaggeration because the truth was dramatic enough. Buffalo Bill Cody, who claimed to have been a Pony Express rider at age 14, built much of his Wild West show's mythology around it, whether his claims were entirely accurate or not. The image of the lone rider galloping across the prairie, mailbag in hand, became an icon of the American West. What's remarkable is how much of the legend is actually true. Yes, there were exaggerations and inventions over the years. But the core story, teenagers risking death to deliver mail across a hostile continent, maintaining impossible schedules through courage and determination, creating a lifeline of communication when the nation desperately needed it, that's all real. Those boys really did face down blizzards and bandits. They really did ride until they dropped from exhaustion. They really did sometimes die in the saddle, frozen or shot or thrown from their horses, and they really did become heroes for it. We remember them because they embodied something genuine and powerful about a specific moment in American history, when the nation was expanding faster than it could manage, when technology hadn't quite caught up to ambition, when human courage and endurance were still the primary tools for conquering distance and danger. The Pony Express produced its share of legendary figures, riders whose names have endured even as many of their fellow riders have been forgotten. We've mentioned Pony Bob Haslam, whose marathon ride during the Paiute War became the stuff of immediate legend. There's William "Billy" Campbell, who rode the first westbound trip out of St. Joseph, Missouri, in April 1860, carrying the mail amid massive crowds and celebrations that treated the event like a national holiday. There's Jack Keatley, who survived that horrific blizzard and countless other near-death experiences. There's William Frederick Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill, though historians debate whether his later claims about his Pony Express service were entirely accurate or somewhat embellished for his Wild West show. But for every famous name, there were dozens of riders we know almost nothing about. Boys who rode faithfully, delivered their mail, survived or didn't, and were never written about in newspapers or dime novels. We have company records listing some names, but we don't have their stories. We don't know what drove them to sign up, what they thought about during those long, lonely rides, what dreams they had, what fears kept them awake at night. We don't know if they felt like heroes or just like kids doing a terrifying job because they needed the money. We don't know if they understood they were part of history or if they just wanted to finish their route and get some sleep. What we do know is that they did the job. For 18 months, through everything the frontier could throw at them, the mail got through with remarkable consistency. The Pony Express maintained its 10-day schedule with a reliability that was genuinely impressive given the circumstances. Yes, there were delays. Yes, mail was occasionally lost. Yes, riders died and routes had to be temporarily suspended. But overall, the system worked. Letters that absolutely had to get through got through, carried by boys who absolutely refused to quit no matter what stood in their way. That reliability, that refusal to quit, was itself heroic. It would have been so easy to give up, to turn back when the weather got too bad or the danger too great, to tell yourself that nobody would blame you for valuing your life over a bag of letters. But they didn't. They kept going. So what do we, sitting here in the 21st century with our instant global communication, our emails and texts and video calls, take from the story of the Pony Express? What does it mean to us? I think it reminds us of something we sometimes forget in our era of convenience and instant gratification. That connection requires sacrifice. That building the networks we take for granted required real people taking real risks. That every advancement we enjoy was purchased with someone's courage and sometimes with someone's life. Those teenage Pony Express riders helped build modern America in a very literal way. They proved that the continent could function as a unified nation. They demonstrated that distance could be overcome by determination. They created expectations, 10 days for a letter to cross 2,000 miles, that drove technological innovation to meet and exceed those expectations. The telegraph made the Pony Express obsolete, but it didn't make it irrelevant. The story endures because it speaks to something timeless about human nature. Our willingness to risk everything for a purpose larger than ourselves, our ability to accomplish the seemingly impossible when we commit fully to it, our courage in the face of overwhelming danger. These weren't soldiers fighting a war, though they faced dangers comparable to combat. They were mail carriers. They were doing a job. But they did that job with such extraordinary commitment and courage that they transformed it into something legendary. We live in a world where we complain if our internet is slow, where we get frustrated if a text message takes 30 seconds to send, where we've completely lost perspective on how miraculous our communication technology really is. The Pony Express riders would laugh at our impatience, or maybe they'd weep at how much we take for granted. They died for letters. They froze and bled and broke themselves for the privilege of delivering words on paper. And they did it willingly, even eagerly, because it mattered, because connecting people across vast distances mattered, because making the nation work mattered, because the messages they carried, business deals, political communications, personal letters, represented real human needs and real human connections that couldn't wait. Their legacy is everywhere if you know where to look. Every time you send an email and expect it to arrive instantly anywhere in the world, you're benefiting from the network mindset they helped create. Every time you assume that distance is no obstacle to communication, you're inheriting a belief they helped establish. Every time you expect reliability from a delivery service, you're applying standards they helped set. The Pony Express taught America that fast, reliable communication across vast distances was possible, and once we knew it was possible, we demanded it, and we built the technologies to achieve it. The telegraph, the railroad, the telephone, the internet, They're all descendants of the same driving need that created the Pony Express, the need to connect, to communicate, to overcome distance and time. In the end, the story of the Pony Express is the story of forgotten heroes who briefly blazed across history like meteors before disappearing back into darkness. It's the story of a business that failed financially but succeeded magnificently in every other way. It's the story of courage in service of connection, of boys who became men in the harshest possible classroom, of sacrifice made willingly for reasons both practical and noble. These riders, most of them teenagers, many of them orphans, all of them braver than they probably realized, carried more than mail across the frontier. They carried the nation's hopes. They carried the promise that America could be one country, not just a collection of distant regions with nothing binding them together. They carried proof that determination could overcome any obstacle, that youth and courage could accomplish what careful adults said was impossible. We should remember them not as romantic figures from a mythical past, but as real people who faced real horrors and real dangers and did their jobs anyway. We should remember that nation building isn't just done by presidents and generals, but by kids on horses willing to ride through blizzards for a paycheck and a sense of purpose. We should remember that every convenience we enjoy was hard-won by someone, somewhere, who paid a price we can barely imagine. The Pony Express lasted only 18 months, but its impact on American identity, on American mythology, on American expectations about what's possible, has lasted more than 160 years and shows no sign of fading. So the next time you send a message and get frustrated that it takes a few seconds to send, think about a 16-year-old kid in 1860, frozen and exhausted, riding through darkness with bandits on his trail, carrying your ancestor's letter because he swore an oath and because America needed him to. Think about what he risked, what he endured, what he sacrificed, and maybe feel a little bit of awe at the courage of teenagers who chose to face death daily so that a nation could stay connected. The Pony Express riders were heroes in the truest sense. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things not for glory or recognition, but because the job needed doing and they were willing to do it. They deserve to be remembered not as sanitized legends, but as the tough, scared, determined, magnificent kids they really were. Orphans preferred, courage required, sacrifice guaranteed, and legacy eternal. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, like the video and subscribe. Thanks.